We begin with new efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy traveled to Turkey to meet with President Erdogan in a bid to revive peace efforts. Erdogan today urged both Ukraine and Russia to return to the negotiating table. Istanbul has already hosted 3 rounds of talks between the two countries. Wednesday's meeting took place as word emerged that Washington was discussing possible peace conditions with Moscow. Zelenskyy said that he hoped to resume prisoner swaps with Russia by the end of this year. All right, we've got team coverage of what is going on at the moment in efforts to bring peace to Ukraine. We want to go to our correspondents, Dorian Jones in Istanbul and Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Dorian, let me begin with you. Erdogan and Zelenskyy, they were just speaking at a press conference. What was the message that came from these two leaders?
Well, the message was that this 2-hour meeting, they discussed the ongoing efforts to bring an end to the conflict. Both President Erdogan and his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, said the talks were constructive and positive, although no real details were given about the talks themselves. Also, President Erdogan reiterated his support for Ukraine, its territorial integrity, and also underlined the important strategic partnership that the two countries have. President Zelenskyy said that they also discussed growing defence cooperation, saying that the products of that cooperation will be seen going forward. But as the efforts to bring an end to the conflict, there were very little information. The fact that the Russians didn't attend this meeting, they ruled out any participation in those talks, underlined for now at least that there wasn't much hope of any cooperation directly with Moscow. President Erdogan said that they are ready to restart the Istanbul process, which has been the venue for talks between Moscow and Ukraine, with Turkey facilitating those talks, which did in the past produce some positive outcomes. This grain deal, which allowed Ukraine to export grain to the international markets from Ukraine safely. But there's little hope that those talks, this Istanbul process, is imminently going to start again. Erdogan just said the door is open for the restoring of this process to bring an end to the conflict.
And Nick, we've got reports that the Americans are talking with the Russians about a possible peace plan. They have not spoken with the Ukrainians. That's the information we have. And here we're seeing the Ukrainian president going to Turkey to talk with the Turkish president. I mean, what is Zelenskyy? What is he trying to get from Turkey?
Well, first off, it's important to say that we've had reporting that Zelenskyy was due to meet Steve Witkoff in Turkey. That hasn't happened. Witkoff isn't there. But that was reported in the last few days that that kind of meeting might have been on the cards. As for Turkey's role in all of this, I think Turkey is basically the only realistic intermediary here. Countries like India, China are just seen as too close to the Russians from a Ukrainian perspective. Even India, even though it's slightly further away from the Chinese position, but still very warm on the business ties and buying a lot of Russian energy. And although Turkey also buys Russian energy, it has managed to find a way of keeping the Ukrainians on side. Those kind of joint defense projects, for instance, are something that really are seen and valued here in Ukraine. And I think it's also just useful as a back channel, right? The Turks can pass messages to Moscow. As Dorian mentioned there, they have offered their cities, their locations as a place for the two sides to meet. Most memorably, right at the beginning of the war, where basically the Russians were offering the Ukrainians nothing but capitulation. And it seems like right now the Russians still want to get the same result without little willingness to compromise more. So there is also the hope that potentially at least some things can be achieved in terms of humanitarian questions, prisoners of war, other kind of humanitarian issues. That is kind of the minimum that can be achieved if you re-engage Russia. And it's all about the blame game. It's about showing that Ukraine is interested in at least engaging with what the Trump administration wants.
And Dorian, I want to pick up on this notion of Turkey as a neutral mediator. Talk to me about how important it is to Erdogan to be seen as a mediator in this conflict.
Well, certainly in the first few years of this conflict, Erdogan made a point of saying that he basically is the only person that has good relations both with Moscow, Ukraine, and also being a member of NATO and close ties with Washington. And they said that had put themselves in a unique position. In some ways, he used as a justification for Turkey's controversial policy of continuing trade with Russia, notably being Russia being the main supplier of Turkish energy, and said, well, that is the price for Turkey maintaining good relations with Moscow. Now, it has to be said, though, in the recent past, last few months, Turkey's ties with Moscow do appear to be somewhat cooling. Erdogan, while still speaks with Putin, not as frequently as in the past. There are fewer face-to-face meetings. And one of the factors that's behind this is that with the election of President Trump, Turkey has improved dramatically its relationship with Washington, and particularly Erdogan's ties with Trump, personal ties, are very close. Trump was in Washington recently, and Trump used that meeting to publicly call for Erdogan to end his balanced approach, saying he wanted him on the American side. And at the same time, Washington has been putting a lot of pressure on Turkey to end its energy imports from Russia, and Turkey has been starting to wind down those commitments with Russia. And that has seen, I think, a cooling in Moscow. They no longer see Ankara as such the even-handed player that it once was, particularly as Turkey is looking to deepen defence cooperation with the European Union at the same time.
GW correspondent Dorian Jones in Istanbul and our correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv. To both of you, gentlemen, thank you. And for more now on Turkey's role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I'm joined by Torrey Taussig. She's a director and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Torrey, it's good to have you with us this evening. Turkey, we have to say, is a member of NATO, and that means that Erdogan, he's walking a very delicate balancing act here. He wants to remain a friend to Moscow, and he wants to remain a good ally within NATO. Is this almost schizophrenic position for Erdogan? Is it affecting the unity within NATO?
First and foremost, Turkey is a NATO ally. President Erdogan has been mentioned, has established good ties with President Trump. The U.S.-Turkish relationship is on good footing. And this administration looks at Turkey as a good mediator for advancing what have been stalled negotiations between Kyiv and Moscow. And so I think Turkey is playing it well at this moment. They have brokered recent deals between Kyiv and Moscow, particularly on the grain deal. They've played an important role in ensuring Black Sea security throughout the crisis. And so I think President Erdogan has actually done a fine job of balancing and walking this tightrope between NATO and Moscow throughout this conflict.
Would you say that Erdogan's role as a mediator, has it given Turkey more bargaining power within NATO?
You know, Erdogan certainly gets some diplomatic cachet for his role within the negotiations. Turkey within NATO is one of 32 allies, and we did see throughout the accession process for Finland and Sweden in recent years that Turkey did establish a fair amount of leverage in holding up the accession process, in particular for Sweden. I wouldn't say that that was attached to leverage that President Erdogan had developed throughout his mediator role between Moscow and Kyiv. But Turkey, again, as one ally of 32, for an alliance that does operate on consensus, has leverage in its own right for ensuring that the alliance moves out in a direction that Turkey is comfortable with.
I mean, so I want to be clear on this. Do you see the role of Turkey being a mediator, especially Erdogan in this role? Do you see it as a role that is going to strengthen his hand when he is looking to gain concessions within NATO or within the European Union, for that matter?
Yes, I mean, he can absolutely use it as an additional bargaining chip when trying to gain certain concessions in its own membership economic arrangement discussions with the EU. I do still think, again, as I mentioned within the NATO alliance, that Turkey is one of 32. The leverage that Turkey maintains within the alliance is at that level as a freestanding NATO ally, just like the other 31. Its mediator role and Erdogan's mediator role is appreciated, but NATO is not a member to this conflict. NATO is not directly engaged. And so I would say that Turkey is actually able to use more leverage in its bilateral relationship with the United States that does have a very strict and a very clear focus on ending this conflict than Turkey does within the NATO alliance.
Torrey Taussig from the Atlantic Council. Torrey, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.